Hello, everyone. It says that there needs to be a passcode, but I don't believe I issued one. If you're still having issues, please let me know. Let's see. Let me check also to see. But I did not set up any. So let me see if the setup requires one. I show 4 participants, so people are getting in, so that's good. So let me go ahead and I'm just going to start, and hopefully everybody can follow ahead. And thank you for joining me this way. All right, so Chapter 3 is about collecting and analyzing marketing information. Before I go on, I'm actually at Appalachian State here in Hickory, so I think I have had the very first class in App State at Hickory, so hooray. Second is they're still doing some work like in the other side of this wall, so you might hear some things. I apologize for that, but without further ado, let's roll on and we will go. Okay, so the first thing to realize is marketing analytics comes from a deep history where marketing is one of the #1 users of research in all business categories. Marketing research is intensive and long and in depth. But one of the things that we found out from research moving to analytics is that the tools that we were using were no longer valid. So marketing research generally involves data points of several hundred, and that the programs that we use, such as structural modeling and partial least squares, are built around finding variability and significance in data sets in the size of 3s and the 400s. Well, what we found is that with marketing analytics and with big data, those particular research tools that we used were no longer valid. I mean, quite simply is, with hundreds of thousands of data points, everything gains significance. And when everything has significance, nothing has significance. And so analytics has basically required us to use an entirely new set of tools. And analytics is also valued important because we'll be talking about the situation analysis and its value in related to that. And so our optimizing the information from data collected makes it more efficient and more effective. But those kinds of pieces of information come from the data that we collect, all right? And so now we're in the era of what's known as big data. Big data involves massive sets, hundreds and thousands, millions of pieces of data from structured and unstructured sources. And by a structured source, I would mean like a reward program, such as that you would find in like Lowe's or any place like that. And unstructured sources are like information pieces that you just find from random information. It's very valuable, but the important thing to realize is that the data is only as effective as the analysis is. You know, big data, in order to be successful, must develop actionable information in a timely manner to be able to use to make valued particular decisions. And so the use of big data, we will talk about in the use of creating the situation analysis. So what are the benefits of big data? Well, there's no surer way of knowing where future trends than by looking at past trends. We can find out which price points are more valued by consumers. Ultimately, hopefully, we can create demands forecasts that come out of that. We can also find and use this for making more personalized approaches. So touch points is a very valued thing, and I've talked about this in hotels. It is not unusual when my wife goes into the Hilton hotels where she is a Diamond member to see that there's a 6-pack of water, because they know that my wife initially will always ask for water wherever she goes. That's some of the personalized approach that you can get from big data sets like this. Certainly you can get improvements in service, especially where you find that you're lacking. And hopefully in the long run, what it'll lead to is long-term increase of sales. So how do we use this, or what's its most valuable piece? Well, it all comes down to using the marketing analysis the marketing analytics in putting together our situation analysis, looking at our internal environments, our customer environments, and our external environments, so that we have more information to be able to make better decisions with. And so in the initial internal environment, we're able to plan our objectives, put together our strategy, and measure our performances through that. In the customer environment, we get to know the 5 W's, which we'll talk about when, where, why consumers purchase the goods and how they do. And then finally, the external environment, which includes our competition, our understandings of where economic growth and stability come from, and then a better understanding of where future trends are going in our particular industries. And so, how do we use big data to conduct our situation analysis? Now, before I go on, let me first kind of throw a caveat out there and realize that situation analysis do not replace human intuition, our own particular insights. The data does not talk, it doesn't think, it doesn't interpret. It will help us to do things like dissecting target markets by separating the heavy users from the occasional users. It will help us understand which features consumers find valuable and which ones they don't, and then also helpfully give us an idea about where our competitors are and how we can do better than them. But it doesn't think. And before I go on, I'm going to kind of give you a particular lesson or an idea just to show you when analysis is not simply enough, all right? So before I go on, let me introduce you to, let's see, I hope I get this right. Oops, wrong one. Let us see again. Let's see. I apologize. Hopefully I've got the right one. Okay, so this is a gentleman by the name of Stanislav Petrov. Stanislav Petrov is known as the man who saved the world. How did he get such a prestigious title? In 1983, the Soviet Union shot down a Korean airliner, a 747, that was known as KAL-007. The United States and the Soviet Union at that time were at a heightened state of war. And during this particular time, a unique temperature inversion over North Dakota, which was where the missile silos for the United States were stored, caused a signal to the Soviet satellites to say that 5 nuclear missiles from the United States had launched. This individual, Stanislav Petrov, was a lieutenant colonel in the missile base, and his job was to verify this and, in essence, signal the start of World War III. Stanislav Petrov smelled a rat. There are things that just didn't make sense. First off, it showed that 5 missiles were launched when standard operating procedure said that if there was going to be a missile launch, it would be launched by massive numbers of missiles. That was the first thing. The next thing was that their early warning system had recently been updated, and he was just an individual that was skeptical about any updates, especially after only 30 or 40 days. And that kind of got on him. The third thing was just quite simply it just simply didn't make sense. There were 30 layers of verification in order to launch the missile codes, and he just got the information too quickly and it gnawed at him. And finally, what happened was, of all of the individuals who said, let's go ahead with the strike, he was the one who said, there's something wrong. I call it a hoax. Let's turn this thing off. And so because he singly as an individual said this is wrong, that's why the Soviets didn't launch. And this is why he got such a prestigious title. So at first, initially, he was praised for his conduct. Later, he was reprimanded because he didn't write down his information. And he said, well, I had a phone in one hand and I had a walkie-talkie in the other. And since I didn't have a third hand, I couldn't write everything down. He was kind of ushered out of the military. He had a difficult life afterwards. But later on, when the full extent of what had happened in the Soviet Union came out, the man was hailed as a hero. So I just wanted to say those things just to let you know that even sometimes when the data is telling you one thing, remember your human intuition sometimes counts more. Okay. So the data doesn't talk, it doesn't think. You're the one who does the thinking. You're the one who has to use your own human intuition and common sense to take that information and turn it into something correct. What is this? This is the diagnosis and the synthesis. This is the taking apart of the information and then putting it together into information that brings some kind of common sense. And that's what your job is. So what this also means is that we have to understand what each word data, analytics, and insight mean. Data is just the facts and the details that are in the information, the raw itself. The information about customers, their product use, their user inputs. It is the analytics that create the discoveries of trends and patterns within the data that ultimately lends us to come up with compelling information. But it's the insights, it's the value of that that helps us to identify what information is usable, that helps us to improve operations. Ultimately, that helps us to understand whether we have found something valuable or not. So an example I would give is that, let's say sales are up 20%. That would be something that the data analytics would show to us. But what if the trends in your particular industry is that sales are up overall 40%? Then perhaps that 20% is not valuable at all. As a matter of fact, it might be a drag. And so this is the difference between data, analytics, and insight. In essence, it means more, or let's just say in a larger perspective, it's put in its place and we understand overall what that meaning means, for the lack of a better word. So, on this slide, there's two things that are very important I want you to understand. Well, any effort should be well-organized, systematic. That's important, and that you should have sufficient resources devoted to your situation analysis. But the next thing that's just as important, or maybe more important than anything, is that situation analysis should be an ongoing effort. It must be constantly pruned and changed and re-understood. It's this constant, ongoing effort, ultimately, that transformed that information into insight. Longitudinal studies are those studies that do not happen in a single fixed state of time, but happen over a range of dates. And that's the importance where situation analysis becomes more valuable. The last thing to understand, it is a job to track all three environments. They are enormously expensive and have a lot of derived effects. Realize that each one of these does not happen in a vacuum in and of itself. All of these things happen and affect each other. And so it's important for us to recognize and understand when things change. So just to give you an idea, I don't know if any of you know of this particular act that's known as the HIPAA privacy rule. The HIPAA privacy rule has been around since 1999, if you look back on its history. Since 1999, its initial proposal, the HIPAA rule has been with us for over 20 years. So what is the HIPAA rule? The HIPAA stands for the HIPAA privacy rules is a standard that protects individuals' medical records from all other particular pieces of information. It sets the limits and conditions in which those uses can be disclosed. And over the last 20 to 25 years, it has had an enormous impact on our lives, whether you know it or not. Think COVID-19. Think over the last 2 or 3 years, where we have had these rules in place that demand that the rights of individuals be protected for privacy, and yet we have all of these other things that we've had to contend with. And so, excuse me, if you just look at what's happening over the last 20 years about the modifications to it, the accounting of disclosures with the HITECH Act, the privacy rules that have to do with clinical laboratory information, all of these things. What I'm basically stating is that when we look at all three, the internal, the customer, and the external environments, everything affects everything else. And so when you do your research on the environments, it's important to understand that all of these things affect each other and they should all be taken into account. Okay, so this last kind of slide puts it all together, kind of gives you an idea of which one is where and who and how. So the internal environment sits in the middle. It's the central location. It's what's going on inside of our little world. The customer environment, if you notice, it's fixed around the 5 W's, and we'll talk about that. And then tomorrow we'll talk about the external environments and how all of those relate together as well. So this is kind of a neat little graphic that kind of shows how everything fits together, all right? Just as I said before, the environments do not operate independently. A shift in one environment may fundamentally change another. And so we don't work in a vacuum, and we need to take all of those things into account. And so let us talk about the internal environment. So there are 3 things that we want to be able to do when we're assessing the internal environment. The first thing that we want to do is we want to assess the firm's current objective, strategies, and performance. And that is the first thing that we're doing when we look at the internal environment. How do we do that? We use what are called metrics. A metric is a measurable indicator of a company's objective. A metric is a measurable indicator of a company's objective. And so the metrics for evaluation can be things such as sales performance, market share, growth rate. These are, if you noticed, are not future evaluations, they are current states. A dashboard is a real-time monitoring that shows the results for each metric. A dashboard is a collection of metrics that is easily monitored, that shows you the current live state. While extremely valuable, real-time monitoring does not negate more formal analysis. You can get target fascination on watching the little metrics go up and down and forget that your purpose is to assess and consider the future. You can find things of concern in the metrics, such as having the wrong goals and objectives. You can have a flawed marketing strategy, which says, in essence, we are getting more income from one thing versus another. We can have a poor kickoff where we fail to hit our target goals. We can have major changes that we haven't taken into account for. The retail industry was at a saturation state about 10 years ago. It finally hit the wall when online sales started climbing dramatically. And yet, retail sales have bounced back, especially with COVID, which almost seems in a juxtaposition. You would think that online would have taken over, and that's simply not true. The last thing is that changes in customer sentiment can completely blow our particular ideas out of the water. So, just to give you an idea of some of the things that can go wrong in those particular strategies. So in the 80s, by the way, I think if you find this on Netflix, it's excellent. It's called the Cola Wars. So in the 80s, well, Pepsi has always been a secondary position to Coke. And it's just the way it has always been. They started Pepsi in the 70s doing what was called the Pepsi Challenge. And so the example of what they did is they put two colas, one right next to each other, and they had consumers choose. Now, I'm a loyal Coke drinker, although haven't drank a Coke this year because I'm on a keto diet. But in terms of colas, I would drink Coke and nothing else. Loyal Coke drinkers know that Coke has a bitter taste. The bitter taste comes from actually the coca plant, the non-active part of a coca plant, and then also the bitter black cherry that they use. Of course, the ingredients are not known. In a blind taste test, Pepsi, because it's sweeter, will always win. It's just that simple. And in the 70s and 80s, it was driving Coke nuts. They could not stand it. And so Coke decided that their objective and their strategy was to beat them at the Cola Wars, and they were going to take everything that they could to do it. So what did Coke do? They made themselves sweeter. They made themselves more like Pepsi. And so they launched New Coke to a furious ad campaign, and it was a complete disaster. Quite simply because they were asking the wrong questions. They were pursuing an objective that for loyal Coke drinkers made no sense. In 6 months, Coke decided that they had to switch back to classic Coke, and that's what they called it at the time. They kept New Coke around, and in 2 years, they phased out New Coke, and it's never been seen again. So this is an example of these measurements that you're doing and ultimately going towards a future that made no sense whatsoever. So this is one of the reasons why you have to be very careful what you're measuring, because it's very easy for you to misinterpret information. Ford had one of these shifts as well. And this happened in the 2000s, and this came when Ford put Alan Mulally as CEO. Talked about Alan Mulally before. He came from Boeing. He was part of the group that created the first digital cockpit. Engineers are fascinating. I've said that before. And what he immediately started doing was starting to eliminate smaller cars, or let's just say slow selling cars. They did away with Jaguar. They did away with International. They did away with multiple brands, and they started focusing on the things that really made money. They are now moving into electric vehicles. They have a dedicated line for commercial vehicles and they're focusing on the #1 vehicle sold in the United States, which is a truck, the Ford F-150. I don't find it surprising that Dodge has taken the Ram and made that its entirely new product line by itself as well, because that is one of the #1 selling. Ironically, folks, passenger cars versus trucks in the United States, the truth is that trucks outsell passenger vehicles, coupes, hardtops, 4-door hardtops by about 2 to 1. America lives on its trucks. And Ford finally understood that and has shifted towards that. And I think you're going to see the classic coupe is going to evolve into the 4-door electric vehicle, which is exactly what it's used for, because it's used for commuter uses less than 300 miles. Predictive analytics is also important to be able to predict the future as much for anything as the logical use of resources. Because if you don't have the resources to plan your future, you're not going to be able to survive. I mean more than just the physical resources. I mean the financial resources, the human capital that it takes for your job to be successful, the experiences within the organizational memory that makes your company successful. Your key relationships with supply chain partners is valuable too. And then finally, the strategic alliances that make your organizations unique and special. Realize that the resources are more than just finances, but HR, technology. Ultimately, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to predict the future by knowing where you are in all capital, physical or otherwise. Human resources can be the biggest challenge when it comes to success. Because if we look at what's happened over the last decade, I'm not so sure that any of you are surprised that human capital, especially consumers, or let's just say workers that have the technological skill necessary to survive, are more important than ever. I kind of give away the beans sometimes, but folks, the most valuable thing in Tesla, I'm going to give you a hint, isn't with the automobiles, all right? And so I'm not going to say anything more than that. But one of the things that you need to do in order to be successful is you need to review the current and anticipated structural issues along with the organizational culture in which your companies live in. Because hopefully from there, they can achieve some kinds of success. The internal culture of your firm, whether it's able to handle and anticipate change, can be one of the most fundamentally important things of all. And you have to understand your corporate culture, especially when it comes to spreading your wings and hopefully buying other resources. There's a whole genre when culture clashes, when organizations try to be able to merge with other organizations. And if those organizations don't have cultures that are sympathetic with each other, you can find disaster. So you need to understand whether the structure of your organization can handle the marketing activities coming down the pipe, or in essence, are they going to collapse? So Amazon decided they needed to get into Walmart's game. They decided that they needed to have a retail outlet. And so what they decided to do was they bought Whole Foods. Now, I'm not sure why they did that. I get the idea of buying a retail store, but of all of the unique cultures, Whole Foods seems to be a little bit strange, and it's turned out to be just as strange as you can expect. There's been a definitive culture clash within Whole Foods and Amazon. And let me also state this, I don't think Amazon values their employees as much as Whole Foods does. Now, once you get up to a certain level in Amazon, it can be a good life from what I've heard. But if you're simply one of the workers on the floor, no. If from what I understand, the workers on the floor have to carry GPS monitors wherever they are. They have programmed bathroom breaks, those kind of things that in the Whole Foods category is a definitive culture clash. In 1992, when Chrysler was purchased by Daimler, they thought that they were getting an equal partnership, but it turned out in essence that Daimler took over their organizations. It wasn't a bad thing, by the way. They needed that. Daimler created consistency. It gave Chrysler the shot in arm that they desperately needed. But about 2 years of that was all Daimler could stand. Daimler, by the way, is Mercedes-Benz, and they jettisoned Chrysler for their better, okay? Wendy's was bought by Hardee's. This was 10, 15 years ago, and there was a definitive culture clash there, ultimately led by, believe it or not, Dave Thomas's daughter, Wendy herself, who owned 23 franchises herself. Ultimately, what happened with that, by the way, is it was a divorce that actually helped both sides. Hardee's came out better for learning Wendy's way of doing it. Wendy's came out better because they expanded the way they did things. It was a successful divorce, for the lack of a better word. But sometimes those things don't happen. So that is the internal environment. Oh, let me say this. So the 3 questions that the internal environment should ask, or the 3 things that they need to do: you need to assess the firm's current objectives and strategies and performance. The second thing is that management needs to review the current and anticipated levels of organizational performance. And they should reflect the anticipated cultural and structural issues that could affect our marketing activities. These are the 3 things that are needed to do when you're doing the internal environment. Second is the customer environment. So, in doing the analysis of the customer environment, some of the things that you should collect are the firm's current customers and their potential ones. Who are their potential customers? Anyone who fits their particular market segment and target market. You need to look at the prevailing needs of their current customers and the future ones. You also have to look at the basic features that the competitors provide, and whether or not they would meet your customer needs as well, and whether or not you need to adopt them. And then hopefully are understanding the anticipated changes in customers' needs. So how can you do this? Ultimately, this is done by research and the gathering of analytics, applying it to the 5W model. The 5W model is exactly what it sounds like. It is who, what, where, when, and the last is why or how our customers purchase our products. And we're going to go through these one at a time. The first is the who. Who are our current and potential customers? Who is our purchaser? For this, we need to collect information, especially at the point of purchase. This is why consumer loyalty programs are so valuable. It's why consumer programs very happily trade 10%, even 20% driven revenue, because if they can attach your purchase with your name, your age, your family lifestyle, all of those things together, that is valuable information that is irreplaceable in making decisions. And so there are three general ways that you can group consumers: demographically, which tend to be categories such as age, gender, family status, income levels. Those are basic demographics. Geographic areas are, of course, limited to particular geographic regions, whether they're as small as a city or as large as, like, Western Carolina would be an example, or the psychographic ones. And what are psychographic ones? Psychographics have to do with three things: your consumers' attitudes, their interests, and their opinions. Psychographics are a much deeper way in which we collect data, because psychographics go across demographic lines. They have to do with our common and shared values and interests, and those are much more powerful when it comes to understanding consumers. So I did very valuable, important research with many of my colleagues. And so one of the most important and valued things that I did research on was such important issues as tailgating, okay? So in tailgating, we collected information about generational cohorts, consumers that are grouped together beyond just merely their ages, but around the common theme of being able to group them by something they value, which was team spirit. Okay? Excuse me. Okay? So I thought this was important. It was important enough for me and Dr. Albinson and Uno Boyo. It was very important for me to collect this information. So we gathered it together. We found it important. And so we found that generationally, consumers in tailgating go for different reasons. The boomers tend to be there to support the teams. They dress in colors, those kind of things, whereas the younger tailgaters, they came for the experience. The experience was more important to them than anything else is. Okay, so, we did what we did. It was very valued information. We found that it was very important, and we also enjoyed the tailgating. Okay, I'm not lying to you. So this is a psychographic kind of thing: attitudes, interests, opinions. It cuts across all ages, all income levels, for the common goal of supporting our teams. Yes, no sacrifice was too big to gather that information. Okay. The next is, what do they do with our products? Not just quantities, but combinations. How do they use them? And this is also important to understand derived demands. Usually one product might depend on the demand of another. And so this is a valued piece of information as well. One of those things, if you notice, when new cell phones come out, one of the biggest things that groups try to do is try to find out the sizes, the functions, what are the ports, because they wanted to develop cases that fit those new phones. And so this is an example of a complementary product that is created using derived demand, all right? So not only do we want to be able to find out what's done with our products, but also how they're used in reverse. In other words, how do they dispose of the products and how successful they are in disposing them, okay? And so what do the customers do with our products? The next is where. What type of vendors do consumers want? Buy online, pick up in store is such a unique phenomenon, yet actually the first time it was mentioned was in 2008, but it took a while for buy online, pick up in store to become valuable. Does consumers want everything to be purchased online? Do you have to see everything to buy it? Those are kinds of the questions that we kind of ask. So just to give you an idea, this used to be an idea that was simply unheard of at one time, and now it's not so unheard of. I'm sure that any of you have been in an airport and found these vendors for these particular products out of a vending machine. It's kind of interesting, the history of vending machines. They came out in the 30s and it started with Cokes. And there was a huge uproar in supermarkets because they were saying, why would people come inside to buy Coke products in my store when they were buying them outside? And what Coke had to do was convince the vendors or the supermarket owners that the people who are outside buying the Cokes from the vending machines are different than consumers who come inside and buy them off the shelf. There is a fundamental difference. That fundamental difference means that I can charge $1 or $1.50 for the Coke outside the store, whereas somebody who comes in the store can buy a liter bottle for 99 cents. Different groups being serviced. When consumers buy can be just as interesting a question, because the whole when part can also have to do with not only seasonal variations, but emergency purchases as well. Do the promotional effects affect buying? Absolutely they do. There's no doubt about it. Especially physical and social surroundings when you're drinking an adult beverage, or purchasing habits, especially during vacations, where you don't, or let's just say that the money pressures are less important. Time pressure can be demanding as well. The pressures to get something done in a certain amount of time pushes the concept where money is no object, and that can definitely affect demand. It also means that you can create the environments, in essence, where consumers are more willing to buy them when they're placed in a certain amount of or certain particular surroundings. So the when can ultimately spur buying, especially when it comes to impulses, because the situation does not lend itself to more detailed buying decision-making. And then finally, the why and the how. How do customers compare to our competitors? How do those products meet consumers' needs and whether they are changing? It's kind of interesting now that bartering has started to come back again. Bartering in the world is a $12 to $14 billion industry. Bartering, in essence, is trading a good for a good or a service for a service. And so we find that consumers are much more willing to barter than they have at any time. And then the question of how also has to do with what. We find that credit card transactions, 23% of them are overall higher transactions versus cash ones. And so we find that consumers are much more willing to make higher purchases with credit than they are with cash. And so these are some of the things that we wish to take into account. The last thing really to understand is with all of these things, we need to know why they don't. What needs do our products not meet? Can we make a realistic assessment of why customers don't purchase? Can we convert our non-customer? Now, this is one of the more difficult questions to ask because it also has to come down to a concept known as non-response bias. In other words, how do we know what our consumers don't want? And it can be a very confusing and a very difficult thing to be able to capture, but it is just as valuable to understand why they don't. Where do we get that information? The broadest pieces of that information comes from social media. The mixed reviews, social posts give us a great idea of where we're falling down. And so if we can convert our non-customer, then we're one step closer to getting back our loyal customers who no longer are loyal. Okay, we are at the end of customer environment. We will finish external environment tomorrow. I hopefully will be in class tomorrow. We will have an activity going on if that works. And if I don't have anything else, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Okay? All right, folks, take care. Be safe out there. Enjoy the weather. And I will see you tomorrow.